This is Dr. Ben White with the Rational Wellness Podcast, bringing you the cutting edge information on health and nutrition from the latest scientific research and by interviewing the top experts in the field. Please subscribe to the Rational Wellness Podcast on iTunes and YouTube, and sign up for my free ebook on my website by going to drwhites.com. Let's get started on your road to better health. Hello, Rational Wellness Podcasters. Thank you so much for joining me again today. And for those of you who enjoy the Rational Wellness Podcast, please go to iTunes and give us a ratings and review so more people can find out about the Rational Wellness Podcast. So on this episode of the Rational Wellness Podcast, we are going to focus on low stomach acid as a cause of SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, abbreviated as SIBO, is the cause of irritable bowel syndrome in the majority of cases. While the large intestine or colon is lined with trillions and trillions of bacteria, the small intestine is relatively free of bacteria. This is because this is where most of the absorption of nutrients from our food occurs. And if there were a lot of bacteria lining the small intestine, it would interfere with that important function. There are a number of mechanisms that prevent more than a small amount of bacteria from growing in the small intestine. And these include the migrating motor complex, which are the peristaltic waves that occur when you haven't eaten for more than 3 or 4 hours, when you hear your stomach gurgling. And these help to sweep out any bacteria out of the small intestine. There's also the GALT or GI-associated lymphoid tissue, which is the immune system that surrounds the digestive tract. And this tends to remove pathogens that enter our body with the food. And then there is the hydrochloric acid secretion from the stomach. And this also serves to kill unnecessary bacteria as well as help us digest our protein. Bile, which is secreted by the liver and stored in the gallbladder, which not only helps us digest fat, but has an antiseptic function and tends to scrub away bacteria from the small intestine. We also have digestive enzymes, which besides helping us digest our food, have an antimicrobial function. And then we also have the ileocecal valve, which is a protective barrier to stop bacteria from migrating from the colon back up into the small intestine. When any of these processes and structures fail, it can facilitate the growth of SIBO. Today, we're going to focus on what happens when you have inadequate amounts of hydrochloric acid produced by the stomach. Our special guest is one of the nation's foremost functional medicine nutritionists, Angela Pifer, who practices in Seattle, Washington. Angela specializes in treating patients with functional gastrointestinal disorders like SIBO and IBS, and she's known as the SIBO guru. She lectures around the world on such topics and has launched a gut prescription recipe site, Gut RX Gurus, and a FODMAP-free line of bone broths, Gut RX Guru Bone Broth. Angela, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to speak to me and our listeners.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Great. So how did you get interested in treating patients with gastrointestinal disorders?
Gosh, I've been in practice about 13 years, and it was just out of the gate. The gut has always fascinated me. There was never anything else. It wasn't even a thought, and I loved it. And to me, there's some other things going on with the body. We can look at the brain and everything, but we start with the gut in so many cases, don't we? Like, how are you digesting? How are bowel movements, moving along? Is digestion working from top down? Like, we have to look at all of that to see how we can then support the body and the system with almost everything else. So it's really kind of this hub, and, working with people with, functional or chronic gut presentations has always just fascinated me. And I think that population as a whole, my lovely patients and anyone out there who's listening who has a functional gut disorder, being in that chronic state, they need help, they need support, they need hand holding, and they really need someone to sometimes step in and be that hub between all their other specialists, because everyone seems to be going off in a different direction sometimes when they're, you know, seeing different specialists. So to have somebody kind of pull everything together is really, really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. For when, you know, if you deal with functional medicine, the gut has got to be one of the starting places for almost everything. I just saw a patient this week, and her big complaint is that she's having unexplained seizures one after the other.
Oh, wow.
And she's been to these neurologists and nobody could figure anything out. So we did some stool test, and she's got all kinds of things going on in her gut. You can't even believe the things happening there, layers and layers. And it turns out she's had all these gut symptoms, which she was really sort of used to and not even complaining about. And now she's doing so much better just by fixing her gut.
Yeah. And I say the word complacency with so much love and respect and empathy for a person. But I think they have this new sense of norm. This is what I deal with day in and day out. This is just how it is. And over time they adapt to it, never liking it, but adapt to it. And it isn't until you show them what it really feels like to not have to sit with that. It's mind-blowing sometimes what they've had to deal with, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, they don't know what it's like not to be constipated or not to have gas.
Yeah.
So can you explain how low stomach acid can be a cause of SIBO, which is the majority of, which is the cause of IBS in the majority of cases?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we look at SIBO, you know, we really have to always consider that SIBO is a secondary condition. It's never a primary condition. It was set up because something else has happened. Some other thing or things have happened. And so we have to try to get at the root of what is setting this up for the person. You know, SIBO needs to be addressed, but we have to look at everything else as well to fix that root cause. So SIBO doesn't continue or come right back or be reoccurrent because you're not fixing the real correct thing here. So, you know, one of the you know, very big contributors can be low stomach acid, and low stomach acid can be caused by a few different things. I mean, low stomach acid could be caused by really, really chronic stress. It could be caused by hypothyroidism as well. So it's this spider web of connections that we have to get in and try to figure out this root cause for people. When we're starting to look at low stomach acid, I mean, this is, you know, it's like not chewing your food. This is like a major component and step within the digestive tract. And if you can't use low stomach acid to actually break your food down properly, and really the main thing is we're talking about SIBO is to clear off pathogens that are coming in. You know, we need that proper, really acidic pH that's under 3 of pH to actually clear everything off. Otherwise, we're just going to get bombarded with things that we're taking in by mouth, you know, multiple times a day. And then that, you know, we want that first step. It's a really big line of protection there. We also have to look at, we've got a pH at that acidity for a reason, and it signals gastric emptying properly. It signals the proper release of bile. It signals the proper release of digestive enzymes. So as you're talking about, as you're in your intro, bile being needed as well to clear out the intestinal tract, we have a lot of conjugated bile within our small intestine. It actually acts as a detergent. So we, you know, every time you eat some fat, your gallbladder goes squish, squish. It's like a stress ball, squish, squish, and it's going to release some bile. And with that, that will help you emulsify your fats. But it's also coming through as a detergent and clearing out that small intestine. And it also happens in between meals. So it doesn't just happen that you get a bile release with your meals. You also get it in between meals. And that's going to piggyback the migrating motor complex and those cleansing waves that come down. So in your intro, I'm gonna disagree just a little bit here, because I think it plays into the conversation we have about what the heck to do with SIBO. I think if we start to compare the trillions of organisms that are in the large intestine, there's so many massive amounts of organisms in the large intestine that when you look at the small intestine, it seems quite minuscule. And yet if we looked at the small intestine just by itself, we're looking at millions and upwards of billions of microorganisms per milliliter per teaspoon of fluid. So it's not sterile by any means. There's lots of organisms there, but we also have forward moving matter. Everything's moving forward. It's not hanging out like it does in the large intestine where everything lays, you know, hangs out there and ferments, and we get all this beautiful, you know, beautiful relationship with our microbiota in that area. things are moving through a lot faster. So we don't get this big buildup of organisms in the small intestine, and we've got bile moving through. Like there's lots of mechanisms to help keep the organism load at a specific load. When one of those mechanisms or multiple mechanisms goes wrong, of course, then we get a buildup, and then we get fermentation happening in the small intestine and lots of other things that can come with SIBO that's quite debilitating, because that small intestine is not meant to stretch, and that causes a lot of pain, and we don't get as much gas movement, of course, out or dispelling across the intestinal lining. So why I say that is so many people think SIBO, I gotta kill it, SIBO, I gotta kill it, and we can't drain out that small intestine. We want to look at this as a rebalancing, really fixing the underlying issue, getting on the mechanisms and what's going on there, but then rebalancing and just taking a person to that level, not kill, and then stepping back, because that's not going to work either. We've got to help reset and rebalance and reseed, affect change with the immune system. And there's so much that goes into play with this. Even once you get somebody to a negative breath test, there's so much healing on the other side to make all of this beautiful work that you've just done stick.
Do you sort of use the 4R or 5R program as kind of a backbone of your approach?
Yeah, I don't. Not with SIBO specifically. Okay. There's so many other things I do. As we start to look at autoimmune and others, I know we're going to talk about an autoimmune condition as we talk here. But in terms of SIBO, I don't. There's so many beautiful things that 4R program does, and there's bits and pieces filled in along the work that is done. But really it's more of the, stabilize the patient on whatever that means. We've got to evoke change with the diet. Oftentimes, we don't always have to go drastically low, but we want to adjust the diet to make sure they're nourished, adjust it to how they're digesting and absorbing, adjust it to make sure that their symptoms are somewhat calmed down so they can hang out in this period of time as we treat properly. So there's a lot of change that happens with the diet. But in terms of kind of that whole repletion, we've got to get on the other side of actually treating SIBO to get to that point that we can start to work on, more of that, reseeding of the gut, a lot of immunoregulatory support at that point. And it's bits and pieces, but not the perfect 4R.
Okay. Sounds good. So when would you suspect that low stomach acid as a cause for a patient with SIBO?
Yeah, I would say that I actually assess that with every patient. And it kind of comes out of the gate when you're doing the intake with the patient and they start to talk about different symptoms that they have.
What kind of symptoms would make you think about low stomach acid? Yeah,
absolutely. Food just feels like it's sitting there and not moving through their stomach. So a little bit of food makes them feel full fast. It could be that we start to look at, they're not breaking down their food. They see a lot of intact pieces of food in the stool. Or even peanut butter stool, I call it. So it's a really sticky stool that takes a lot of wipes. They're probably not breaking their proteins down. So then we would look back upstream and figure out what's going on there, which low stomach acid is oftentimes a culprit at that point. I would say what I see with a lot of patients is a lot of burping. Food just feels like it's a heavy weight in their stomach. They need to space their food out because they don't feel like they're digesting at a quick enough clip that they can eat a little bit more consistently than that. And then as we step back and look at labs, SpectraCell, nutritional markers, we can look at different things to see if, their iron is trending lower, B12 is trending lower, and we would see that if they had low stomach acid.
Okay. Once you suspect that a patient has low stomach acid, how would you figure out what is causing the low stomach acid, whether it be H. pylori infection or autoimmune related or something else?
Yeah, I think we always are going to start with the basics. I mean, unless somebody presents with a really chronic case where they've had just chronic low B12 over time, I'm going to start to step into some of those advanced markers looking for antiparietal cell or anti-intrinsic factor antibodies to see if there's actually something going on more as an autoimmune front. But as we start to look at this, how are they digesting their food? What is their diet presenting like? Can we correct this with supplements? And then what is also going on in terms of their lifestyle? If they're, really in a sympathetic state, we work a lot on stress reduction because a sympathetic state, being more stressed chronically over time, is really going to drive digestive chemicals away from the digestion from top down. So there's a lot of lifestyle, effect that we can have as we start to help people move away from that. But really, and again, I'll say this with great love for the patient that is sitting there feeling like this is just this chronic presentation and they deal with this all the time. Most people with the functional gut disorders like this feed-forward cycle, stress is always going to contribute to that. But then once it's present, they're having to deal with these symptoms all the time. And so stress is almost always some sort of factor that's adding to that. And so I think there's a lot of, I introduce people to the Wim Hof breathing method. I have them make sure that they're walking an hour a day.
Wim Hof is when you get in a cold shower?
No, Wim Hof is actually, so that's more contrast hydrotherapy. Wim Hof is actually a breathing technique. You should look them up on YouTube. It'd be interesting to have on your podcast. It's I don't even know if I'll explain it correctly. It's this beautiful way of actually really taking in almost this hyper amount of oxygen into your blood, and huge diaphragmatic breathing technique. And then you actually ride that out a little bit. But in terms of oxygenation and capacity, people aren't using the full lung that they have and lungs and moving enough. And so it's a really interesting breathing technique to get them to use that entire space, diaphragm. Yeah, it's very, very cool. So I think there's a lot that we can do in terms of just the stress piece, to really help people out. But as we're starting to look at the low stomach acid piece, we've got to really listen to the patient, and SIBO is going to contribute once SIBO is set up in terms of, and where SIBO is at in the small intestine. So the further SIBO is up and the worse SIBO is, with all those contributing factors, it can start to break down digestive enzymes in that brush border, uncouple bile. It can really interfere with a lot of nutritional absorption that we're doing in that area. And so, it just depends on the patient as we're working on to what degree we need to come in and do any kind of intervention at that point.
So how would you rule out H. pylori? What tests do you like to use for H. pylori?
Yeah, I actually prefer the breath test for H. pylori.
Okay.
I really do. The urea breath test. That's my favorite one. Oftentimes I want to see a GI effect, so we'll add that on as we look at a stool antigen for that. Right. Yeah. If they've never been diagnosed with H. pylori, then we'll do a blood antigen. But I really like the breath test. I know there's a little controversy on if SIBO's present, sometimes you'll get a false positive. I've not seen that line up. And then of course we have endoscopy, right? As we're referring over to the GI doctor. But I think the urea breath test is really pretty straightforward to me. I think the antigen test for the stool antigen actually misses it a lot more than when we see that breath test.
So the notes you sent me over before we did this podcast, it was really interesting that you talked about how if H. pylori grows in one part of the stomach, it's associated with increased hydrochloric acid. For those of you who aren't aware, H. pylori is often an undiagnosed cause of ulcers because you get this bacteria that burrows into the wall of the stomach, and then the stomach produces more and more acid to try to get rid of it. And so it can often be the true cause of ulcers. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if that H. pylori grows in another part of the stomach where the cells that make the hydrochloric acid are, it actually destroys those parietal cells and you end up with less hydrochloric acid from H. pylori.
Yeah. So you really can't go off of, there's some symptoms that are present that we need to investigate if H. pylori is present. I mean, to me, any kind of burping, if they're chronic burping, I think H. pylori should be ruled out. But any kind of burning, any kind of warmth in the stomach, a really early sense of fullness, we really should be ruling out H. pylori and then stepping through the sequence from there.
And you also mentioned in your notes that GI docs, when they do an endoscope, they're often looking in that part of the GI tract where H. pylori leads to ulcers, but not the, what's the other part of the stomach where?
Yeah, so if you think about the stomach like a kidney bean, like up on its end, you've got the fundus is up top, the body is kind of in the middle, and then the antrum is on the bottom. Okay. And when we start to look at parietal cells, which produce stomach acid, they're in the fundus and the body, so in this upper 2/3 part. And then in the bottom part is the antrum. And if you look on almost every single endoscopy, they're doing biopsies in the antrum. They're looking for H. pylori, and they're going to miss if there's an autoimmune issue with parietal cells. And they're also doing a biopsies in the duodenum to see if they're celiac. So I feel like if, especially as we're going to get into it here, we really should be assessing the whole stomach and looking a little bit beyond this. But it's interesting, even when recommended that it doesn't come back as the biopsy in that area, I think they're just on, and I say with great respect, they do things none of us can, but that's just where they're looking, and they're not looking in the fundus or the body.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, you have to try to develop a relationship. There's not many integrative GI docs around.
Yeah.
Fortunately, we have Dr. Abar in LA, so.
Yeah. And Dr. Mullen, yep.
Yeah. Is he in LA?
No, Dr. Mullen, Jerry Mullen.
Oh, yeah. So let's talk about autoimmune atopic gastritis. What are some of the symptoms associated with that in particular, and how do we assess for that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think when we start to look at autoimmune, there's a lot of conversation around, the CDTB toxin and autoimmunity coming from that, and that being a cause of this IBS-C or SIBO. What we have to look at is that's, definitely a percent that can set SIBO up. But when we're starting to look at the population that has low stomach acid and trying to get to the root of what's going on with SIBO, there's going to be a small percentage there that we really do have to have, keen eye on to see if any of those people have autoimmune atrophic gastritis. And basically what that is that you've got some atrophy of the stomach, and you have gastritis, which is inflammation. So we've got atrophy and inflammation, and then you've got this autoimmune involvement. And so atrophic gastritis, there's two types. One is caused by H. pylori, and the other is autoimmune atrophic gastritis. And so basically we've got the autoimmune involvement, and you've got antibody production against the parietal cells. And so as we start to talk, deeper into low stomach acid and its implications, when we start to look at autoimmune atrophic gastritis, this is everything that we just talked about tenfold, because this isn't simply more stress induced or a bit of hypothyroid, pushed in terms of setting that metabolic rate, how much stomach acid you're producing, or you've got a zinc deficiency. All of those can be recovered fairly easily, depending on the case. But what we're really talking about is, an autoimmune connection here with low stomach acid. And I think to discuss this, we kind of have to talk first about prevalence, because I think it seems like a kind of a foreign term, and yet when we start to look at prevalence, everyone's pretty much heard about celiac. Almost everyone is screened for celiac, especially if there's digestive stuff going on. So even as practitioners, we're so quick to jump on that. But when we look at celiac disease, it's 0.5 to 1% prevalence in the US. Very, very small percent of people. And if you have it, it's a very big deal. But it's a small percent of people. And yet, as practitioners, we're fairly quick to rule that out. When we look at autoimmune atrophic gastritis, we're actually looking at a 2 to 8% prevalence. So even if we just take the 2%, it's 2 to 4 times more likely present than celiac. And so we really have to kind of stand up and pay attention to this. When we look at atrophic gastritis caused by H. pylori, that's actually going down in America because it's being screened for. But when we look at autoimmune atrophic gastritis, it's going up. It's starting to increase, as are a lot of the autoimmune conditions, right? People are becoming more susceptible, and we can have a whole 10 shows over why we think that is, right, Ben? But when we're starting to look at the autoimmune atrophic gastritis, basically what we're looking at is we've got inflammation in the stomach, atrophy of the stomach. We see a breakdown of the parietal cells because you're making antibodies against those. And when we look at the parietal cells, those make stomach acid, and they also make intrinsic factor. And intrinsic factor is what binds to your vitamin B12, and that coupling, as it moves through the intestines, is absorbed together. If you're not making intrinsic factor, you're not going to absorb your B12. And if you're not making stomach acids, you're not going to break down your proteins to get to your, B12 in the first place. So, as we start to look at this, this patient population, what we, this isn't everyone that needs to be screened for this, but we have to start to look at if there's a chronic digestive, presentation here. And we really want to start to key into this is if somebody's taking massive handfuls of HCl betaine and they've been doing that for a really long time, or they don't digest their food, this is something that we should be screening them for. When we start to look at this, we kind of have this.
By the way, do you ever use that HCl challenge test as a way to screen for this?
I don't as a way to screen for this. I refer people over for the Heidelberg test. If we're going to look at, for suspecting low stomach acid, especially if I see them on this level of HCl betaine. I feel for a time that was really working for me. So setting aside autoimmune atrophic gastritis, it was working for me in terms of getting people on a certain load, and it was making a difference. And then I feel like it just didn't work as well anymore. So
right. By the way, for people who aren't aware of what we're talking about, this is where you give a patient one HCl tablet taken before a meal, and then you give them 2, or taken after a meal, and then you give them 3, and you keep increasing it till they get a burning sensation, and then you back off.
Yeah, or warming sensation, but yes.
Warming, yeah.
Yeah. So I've seen that work for some people. I've seen other people, a lot of times when people come to me, they've been to quite a few practitioners and they've already done that test in the past. So, we just kind of learn from what they've already been working through.
Yeah.
So it's pretty interesting. So I would just go off more symptoms of what we would expect. Again, total protein's low on a lab. You've got B12 that's chronically low. Iron is low with no really good cause for it. And when you're recovering it, they're kind of this not lifelong, but say for the last few years at least, because this kicked in at some point, they've been trending more towards anemia, and they're not quite getting it recovered. What
tests do you like for B12 and for iron?
Yeah, I do serum B12. I do serum B12. And then when we're looking at iron, it's just the full panel. Serum, TIBC, saturation, ferritin. And then, of course, looking at all the rest of the CBC, looking at, whatever.
You don't find the need to do like methylmalonic acid or homocysteine for B12 status?
I actually like both of those and looking at folate and B12.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I look a little bit more at that. And of course, it depends on what I see in terms of supplementation that they've been on, for a really long time. But I'm also looking at that more for folate and B12 status and methylating.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. When you let's talk about treating a patient with low stomach acid. How do you approach that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think low stomach acid and autoimmune atrophic gastritis are going to be really 2 different things in terms of, approaching that.
So let's say, let's start with a few different cases. Let's start with somebody who's got low stomach acid because they've been taking proton pump inhibitors for years. How do you handle that?
Yes, absolutely. With their doctor's approval for coming off of medication, of course, I actually will start to add in bitters. I'll have them cook all their vegetables. I'll have them eat more frequent meals just to start. And then we're really going to work on stress management, setting the tone for the meal, and chewing their food 3 times more than they think they need to. We might need to adjust fat load a bit, just depending on how well their gastric emptying is going. We might need to adjust things that way. But I work a lot with that. I love bitters. I love them.
And bitters are designed to stimulate your own digestive enzymes and acid secretion, right?
Absolutely. And our food, it's kind of crazy to think about. Even our broccoli and Brussels sprouts are bred for sweetness. All the bitterness, the bitter, the different species within all of those, they're all bred more sweet. We're setting aside anything that has more bitter because the masses don't trend towards that, right? In terms of what we're choosing at the supermarket. So when we give somebody bitters, it literally is bitters. Your mouth actually, you've got these beautiful taste receptors back here that just light up when you give somebody bitters. And if you even think about it, if you've done it, it makes your mouth water. It's really stimulating digestion from the top down. So I have people, I like Quicksilver Scientific, their Bitters 9 or their Bitters X are fantastic. And I just have them do 1 or 2 pumps 15 minutes before a meal. They hold it in their mouth for 90 seconds, swishing it around, trying to get it to the back. And then they swallow. We got bitter receptors in our stomach as well. So it's wonderful. It's a great way to kind of help stimulate digestion there. In terms of digestive enzymes, one of my favorites is Pamplex toothpaste by Integrative Therapeutics. It has a low-level digestive enzyme, low-level bile support, and just a little bit of HCl betaine. So I think less is more. I want to kind of, just start with these lower levels and work up from there. So that's how I would approach it. I would try to set the tone for the meal, really look at your food, smell your food, think about, you know, where it came from, what it's going to taste like, put that first bite in your mouth and really set your fork down and taste it. And to me, that sets the tone for the meal and really slows people down.
When you're weaning patients off of PPIs, you have to be careful about sort of a rebound, right?
Yeah. You do. You know, I've had really great luck, again, with, you know, doctor approval on this. Really great luck in weaning people off of proton pump inhibitors. There hasn't really been a case that I haven't been able to do because we set everything else up first. And then depending on the medication, we might be able to have that medication, or we just start to slowly, you know, take that every other day. And I'll always aim that around a weekend, because if you've ever really watched people's food journals over the course of a week, like year after year, like I have, you realize that hunger is much more increased during the week. Like there's just more stress going on. So I start to wean them over a weekend, and you know, have them have just a little bit of baking soda on hand if they need to do like a half teaspoon of baking soda and water just to take the edge off. And then they have the medication. If something comes up, you know, nobody is asking them to sit in misery with heartburn, but it usually is it's usually pretty good. I think most people just try to stop cold turkey, and then they realize that didn't go well, so they feel like they're really trained to it. So you just have to work with them to get them set up.
Okay. And then how do you treat patients with the atrophic gastritis? And is it the same treatment if it's autoimmune origin or H pylori?
Yeah, so atrophic gastritis is caused by H pylori, and so there's some great treatments out there for H pylori. What we're talking about is the autoimmune atrophic gastritis,
Okay.
and that's going to be more from an autoimmune perspective. So you know, just as if there's autoimmune thyroid, you're going to treat the thyroid, but you're also going to treat the autoimmune condition. So with autoimmune atrophic gastritis, you're going to treat the autoimmune condition in that you've got to work on, you know, the whole stress cycle with everybody, getting them sleeping well, calming down the body's reason for ramping everything up and attacking. You want to calm down and figure out triggers, you know, if they're, you know, where triggers are coming from, whether it's stress, environmental, internal, in terms of food and all. And then we really want to look at treating the nutritional deficiencies, making sure that they're, you know, recovering their B12, recovering their iron. So when we look at autoimmune atrophic gastritis, the vast majority of cases aren't even diagnosed until they're completely at this end stage of pernicious anemia. And that pernicious anemia is basically you've got anemia because you can't absorb your vitamin B12 and you need B12 along the iron pathway. And then you've got this autoimmune component causing this. So pernicious anemia is also an autoimmune condition, but it's this end stage of autoimmune atrophic gastritis. So most people aren't diagnosed till that point. So we want to catch them before that. We want to catch them when they consistently have B12 levels of under 500, that we see indications of pancreatic insufficiency. So they've got this low stomach acid and signaling of the pancreas. You know, we don't see that in that connection. We want to look for vitamin B12 deficiency symptoms like peripheral neuropathy. We want to look for even restless leg syndrome, which is strongly connected to this. But, you know, again, at that beginning, they're going to have poor gastric emptying. They're going to feel full. They've got this excessive burping. Sometimes they feel a little nauseous because food is sitting there. And all of this has been kind of chronically presenting. We've got a store of iron in our system, you know, in our body. It isn't until we really start to see this very big shift, and same thing with B12, this really big shift with this autoimmune kind of attack. We don't usually see this start to rear up for a good year and a half, 2 years. So we want to catch this earlier on, and it might be that chronic presentation that we get to see that with. So again, first, you know, rule out H pylori. Absolutely, let's rule that out. But then let's start to look at, you know, do we start to see B12 levels dipping down, which is kind of hard sometimes because everyone's taking B12. So, and B12, you know, serum B12 is really a great indication that you're taking good supplements sometimes. So, you know, maybe we need to take people off of things for a couple of weeks to get a better read on that serum level. But we want to look at that. We want to investigate gastroparesis if that's there, or, you know, again, if gastritis is present, we're going to look for H pylori, and then start to look at iron and B12 and start to recover those. If somebody's gone to the point of pernicious anemia, they might need iron shots. They might need intramuscular B12 shots. The supplementation may not do it. And this population, of course, is interesting because they've got lower stomach acid and poor signaling, and oftentimes they're going to have slower motility. So if you're trying to recover iron on a consistent basis, you can really slow things down more because iron can be quite constipating. And iron isn't necessarily, it can be toxic to the colonocytes as well. So, sometimes iron shots are going to be a better choice depending on that patient and what's going on there.
Interesting. And of course, trying to heal the gut as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's going to come with it. And I think that comes with a lot of conditions out there as as well.
And those patients are going to need HCl supplementation probably for the rest of their lives, right?
They probably will. And, I think it's, again, if somebody has an autoimmune condition, we need to be able to tell them that they have an autoimmune condition because autoimmune comes in pairs. And also, I would say that autoimmune, as we start to look at this, we need to be able to say, like, there is a reason that you might need ongoing supplementation in terms of HCl betaine, in terms of B12 support, in terms of iron support. And there's a connection to be made there with the patient, because sometimes I think, patients might go practitioner to practitioner and they've got these long laundry lists of supplements and we don't know which are necessary and which aren't. But if we've got an autoimmune condition set up for this, they're going to need to really support their system long-term because of the autoimmune condition that's present. And the more stressed out they get from wherever this is coming at, the worse the autoimmune cycle can get. And then you get more degradation of those, and targeting of those parietal cells, which makes everything downstream worse. So the stress management piece can't be talked about enough with this population. But then we also have to start to look at how else are we going to support them, and they're going to need supplementation lifelong. They're going to need it. It's absolutely. And so they need to know that and be able to connect with it, because I think people can fall in and out of favor with supplements, or, I don't know if these are even doing anything for me kind of thing. But in this case, this is something that really needs to be looked at. Definitely.
So can you monitor those anti-parietal cell antibodies the way you monitor like TPO antibodies with patients with Hashimoto's to see, to what extent their autoimmune component is active or
yeah,
down?
You really can, but I think we have to be careful to say, if say, parietal cell antibodies are at 82 and they go to 72, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily getting better. Antibodies are volatile. They don't just go up a ladder and down a ladder depending on two things. If we are in a very stressful situation, we can see a shift there. If we are fighting off a cold, we can see a shift. If we
right, but maybe are there bigger shifts like with TPO, antibodies for thyroid? If they have 500 and it goes up to 1,000, that's significant. Or if it's 1,200 and it goes down to 150, they still have elevated antibodies, but that's a significant shift. Whereas if it goes from 100 to 200, maybe is insignificant.
I completely agree. Yeah.
When there's is there a similar sort of range with the antiparietal cells?
I think it's going to be based on the person and what we're looking at with both of those and where they kind of fall into. I think as we start to look at the progression and how long this has been there for people and how advanced they are, they might not be able to get those fully recovered like we'd like. Right. But for the antiparietal cells, the anti-intrinsic factor antibodies, we look at both of those. And then, of course, if there's a positive test, we're going to refer over to a GI doc to get a biopsy. But in the right place, they've got to biopsy the fundus or the body of the stomach to be able to actually, confirm that.
Cool. Okay. That's good. Very interesting information. Thank you for informing us about a condition I think most patients and even a lot of practitioners are not aware of, which is autoimmune atrophic gastritis as a cause of low stomach acid leading to SIBO.
Yeah.
So how can listeners and practitioners get a hold of you if they want to contact you or sign up for your courses, get your bone broth?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So my practice site is SIBOguru.com. And I'd love to have everybody visit me there. And then GutRxGurus.com is a beautiful collection of practitioners and chefs that are in the low FODMAP realm. And there's a SIBO specific category in there, and everything is low FODMAP. And I'll say really quick, I don't, as a whole, put every single person that's ever even, SIBO's glimmering on a low FODMAP diet, but there's going to have to be some adjustments. And so to be able to have a recipe set that you can go to really fill in the gaps and give people ideas, right? Because we're so used to eating what we eat, and then when we can't eat that anymore, it's like chicken on a plate. Like, what do you do? So it's nice to be able to have all these beautiful recipes for sauces and, sweets if you need them and all. So the food's just really tasty. So that's a subscription site for recipes, GutRxGurus.com. And then GutRx bone broth, a first FODMAP bone broth to hit the market, and people can order that online and just ships directly to their door. And we actually ship beautiful, high protein, high gelling bone broth that tastes absolutely amazing. We've got a big plant here in Seattle, and we sell beef and we sell chicken, and it is just absolutely delicious. So it's nice to have that kind of fill in the gaps and have that as a base of a soup, because you can't just go to the store and get a garlic-free, onion-free anything, right? Everything has it in it. Yeah. So it's nice to have a broth that, people can really connect to there.
Cool. Great. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Of course. Thank you.
Okay. I'll talk to you soon, Angela.